Welcome, dear listener. Let your thoughts drift quietly now, like smoke curling upward from the chimney of an old wooden home nestled deep in the countryside, and allow your breath to settle into a slow and peaceful rhythm as we journey back to the murky corridors of time, to a place dimly lit by flickering rushlights, where the air carries the earthy scent of damp straw and wood smoke, and where life moves at the pace of the seasons, guided by bells, by bird song, and by the weary rhythm of human hands, working against time. Our story begins not with a clash of swords nor the pronouncements of kings, but in a far more humble setting, among fields soaked by recent rain and homes built of wattle and daub, where a single cough in the night would stir more fear than the howl of wolves or the tolling of the church bell, and where illness came not as an unexpected surprise, but as a familiar, lurking shadow, one that most would encounter many times before their bones found rest in the cold earth. It is just before sunrise, and the first pale threads of dawn are beginning to weave their way through the narrow slats of a wooden shutter, casting faint, grayish light onto the packed earth floor of a one-room cottage. The thatched roof above is low, and the smoke from last night's fire still lingers, curling sluggishly in the rafters before drifting out through a small hole near the peak of the roof. In the corner, beneath a blanket woven from rough wool and patched many times over, lies a man, not old, but not quite young either, though the years have worn deep lines into his face and left his hands gnarled like the roots of a tree. He has not risen with the others, not joined the day's chores or walked out to the fields, and his breathing is heavy, labored, like wind pressing through a narrow crack in the door. His wife hovers nearby, her hands wringing the edge of her apron, eyes flicking between the hearth and her husband's flushed cheeks. She had known it was coming, had heard the coughs deepen over the past week, had watched as he slowed in his work and winced with each step. But in these parts, there was no doctor to summon, no physician to consult. There was only the old woman who lived at the edge of the woods, the one people called wise but sometimes feared, who brewed her teas from bark and root and whispered prayers over bowls of steam. The wife hesitates, listening to another rasping breath, then nods to her eldest son, who is barely 10, and sends him running through the mist-laced morning to find her. Outside, the village stirs slowly to life, not with urgency, but with the resigned pace of people who have long since surrendered their lives to cycles they cannot control. Chickens cluck half-heartedly near the coop, a donkey brays in protest of the cold, and across the narrow dirt path, a neighbor draws water from the communal well, casting a glance toward the sick man's home and crossing herself quietly. Sickness is no stranger here. In the past year alone, the village has buried 4 children and 2 elders, and every winter, the fevers come like wolves to thin the flock. They do not ask permission. They simply arrive. Inside the cottage, the fire has been stirred back to life, and a pot of thin porridge simmers over the flames. The sick man groans softly, his forehead beaded with sweat, his breath now whistling faintly, as if each inhale must claw its way through thick reeds. His wife presses a damp cloth to his brow, not because she expects to help, but because it is what her mother did, and her mother before her, and in the absence of knowledge or cure, habit becomes hope. The children are quiet, unusually so, huddled near the hearth, sensing that this silence is not the kind they are supposed to break with play. The wise woman arrives just after mid-morning, cloaked in a heavy shawl, her face weathered and stern. She carries with her a bundle of herbs wrapped in linen and a pouch of dried roots, and though her presence offers no certainty, it brings a measure of calm, as though action, however simple, is a kind of defiance. She kneels beside the man, murmurs a brief prayer under her breath, and opens his mouth to place a small pinch of powder on his tongue, something bitter and sharp, made from crushed yarrow in the bark of the willow tree. She listens to his breathing, lays a hand on his chest, and frowns. He is too hot, she says simply, and begins preparing a poultice from crushed mint and vinegar. She places it on his forehead and ties it in place with a strip of cloth. She does not promise recovery, nor even improvement, but neither does she speak of death. Not yet. She turns to the wife and instructs her to boil more water, to keep the man warm but not too warm, and to recite a simple prayer at intervals, one said to protect the soul as it fights within the body. Outside, the sky darkens again, though it is not yet noon. The clouds hang low and heavy, pressing down on the village like a great hand. A drizzle begins to fall, soaking the thatch and dampening the earth. In the distance, a bell tolls. 1, 2, 3 times. Not for this man. Not yet. But for another in a neighboring hamlet. Another soul claimed by the invisible hand that stalks these lands. As the day wears on, the sick man begins to mutter, his words slurred and strange, fragment of prayer and memory tangled together. The wise woman takes this as a sign that the fever has reached its peak. She mixes another draught, this time of valerian root and a hint of ale, and pours it slowly between his cracked lips. His limbs twitch, then still. The room remains quiet. The fire crackles. A chicken clucks once, sharply, as if disturbed by something it cannot see. The wife is beside her husband, eyes fixed on his chest, watching it rise and fall, slower now, steadier. For the first time that day, she allows herself to exhale. The wise woman, sensing her moment is finished, gathers her things and leaves without fanfare, melting into the mist like a shadow never quite real. Outside, the drizzle has stopped, and a faint patch of blue peeks through the clouds. But even as one sickness begins to retreat, another waits patiently in its place. For in this world, the threat of illness is never far. It lingers in the water, in the soil, in the breath of a stranger. And though this day may end without death, the grim shadow remains close, always watching, always waiting, always ready to remind them of their place in a world where life is short and medicine, such as it is, walks hand in hand with superstition and fear. And so, as the sick man drifts into a fevered sleep, and the village settles once more into its ancient rhythm, a soft wind begins to rise, carried with the scent of crushed herbs, old smoke, and something else, something faintly metallic, like blood in the air, a scent that leads us deeper now, toward another fire, another home, another family placing their hope in the hands of a healer who speaks not of science, but of balance, of elements unseen, and of the restless humors that rule the fragile bodies of all who walk these muddy paths. The wind, soft though it may be, carries with it more than just a scent of damp earth and ash. It bears a kind of memory, a whisper of things forgotten and remembered again with each shifting breeze, a reminder that while the village lies quiet beneath its canopy of clouds and thatched rooftops, the old ways have not yet been lost. Not entirely. Not while there are still those who walk paths others avoid, those who gather by moonlight and speak to plants in hushed tones, those who carry not swords nor scripture, but bundles of dried roots, scraps of worn parchment, and minds full of lore passed down to the fragile threads of generations. And so we turn now to such a figure, not a doctor, not a priest, but a woman whose name changes with the tongue that speaks it, though all know her by her reputation more than her title. In this village they call her simply Grana, and in every whisper of wind and turn of leaf, her knowledge lingers like the faint heat of a long-dead fire. Grana does not live within the cluster cottages that line the muddy lanes of the village center. Her hut rests at the edge of the wood, where the trees grow close and the undergrowth is thick with nettle, foxglove, and moss. It is not a place of fear exactly, but it is not often visited without reason. Children are warned not to wander too near, and even grown men tread lightly when approaching her door, as if the soil itself remembers stories of curses and cures alike. But those who come to her do so out of necessity, not choice, for when the church fails and the stars fall silent, it is to Grana that the desperate turn, carrying their fevers, their boils, their griefs and ghosts, and placing like offerings at her weathered doorstep. The woman is old, though it is difficult to tell just how old. Her back is bent, her hands gnarled, her hair a tangle of white and silver that glimmers like cobwebs in candlelight. Her eyes, however, are sharp, piercing and watchful, like those of a bird that has seen too many winters and has learned to recognize the shape of death long before it arrives. Her home is small, just a single room with a low ceiling and walls blackened by years of smoke, but it is filled with smells both strange and soothing: lavender, rosemary, wild garlic, damp wood, and something else, something metallic and slightly sweet that clings to the air like a ghost refusing to depart. Hanging from the rafters are bundles of herbs, dried mugwort, rue, sage, and thyme, each tied with colored string, and arranged in a manner known only to her. Along the far wall stands a shelf laden with earthenware jars, each meticulously labeled with scratchy ink: powdered elm bark, dried beetles, poppy seeds, powdered bone. Beneath the shelf, a collection of wooden bowls and pestles, their surfaces worn smooth from decades of grinding. A single stool sits by the hearth, beside a small cauldron in which something brown and thick bubbles gently, releasing occasional wisps of steam that curl toward the thatch above like silent prayers. Gran is already at work this morning, muttering to herself as she sorts through her collection, her fingers selecting leaves and stems with the ease of someone who no longer questions which plant does what, but rather feels it, instinctively, the way a musician does not count notes but simply plays. She speaks to the plants sometimes, not loudly, not clearly, but in murmurs, as though coaxing them to give up their secrets or thanking them for their silence. Outside, the boy sent from the village waits uncertainly, shifting from foot to foot, reluctant to disturb her, but aware of the urgency that sent him here. When she finally opens the door, she says nothing at first, merely looks at the boy with those bright eyes, and then gestures for him to follow. She does not need to ask who is ill. She always knows. Illness has a scent, a weight, a vibration in the air that she claims to feel in her bones. She listens to the boy's description, his father's fever, the coughing, the strange, distant muttering, and nods, her face unreadable. She returns to her shelf and selects a few jars without hesitation, placing pinches of powder and curl roots into a linen pouch, then adds a small wooden talisman carved with unfamiliar symbols. "Brew this in water and make him drink," she says, her voice hoarse like dry leaves brushing across a stone path. "Tie the charm above the door to keep the sickness from spreading. Burn rosemary in the hearth. Speak only kindness in the room." She does not wait for questions. There are never many, not with Grana. The villagers may not understand her methods, but they know better than to doubt them, for she has saved more than she has lost, or so the stories say. And in a world where doctors are too far and priests too silent, her wisdom carries its own kind of power, heavy and wordless, like the night before a storm. The boy thanks her, stammering, then turns and runs, the pouch clutched tightly to his chest, as if it contains gold or fire. She watches him disappear into the mist, then returns to her hearth, stirs the cauldron once, and begins whispering to the steam. Meanwhile, back in the village, the sick man still lies motionless, though the flush in his cheeks has deepened, and his breath now rattles faintly, like dry reeds in wind. His wife has done as instructed, boiled water, placed damp cloths on his skin, and whispered prayers with trembling lips. When the boy bursts in, she snatches the pouch from his hand and follows the instructions with a fervor born not of belief, but a hope, because hope in this place is more valuable than sense and more powerful than reason. The potion tastes bitter and causes the man to gag, but she holds his nose and forces him to swallow. She ties the charm to the doorframe, sprinkles ash around the threshold, and begins to burn sprigs of rosemary and dried juniper on the hearthstone, watching as the smoke curls upward and dances in the light of the fire. For a long while, nothing changes. The room is silent, except for the crackle of the flame and the occasional groan from the man's fevered dreams. The children sit quietly, their eyes darting to the door every few minutes, as if expecting something, an angel, a spirit, a sign. But the only visitor is the smoke, and perhaps that is enough, for in its drifting patterns they begin to see shapes, circles, spirals, a kind of slow, sleepy rhythm that soothes even as it bewilders. And then, just as the sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden lines across the floorboards, the man stirs. It is not a sudden recovery, not a miraculous revival, but a shift, a softening of the breath, a loosening of the jaw, a sigh that seemed to carry away some small measure of the illness that gripped him. His wife leans closer, places a hand on his brow, and finds it cooler than before, not cold, not healthy, but no longer burning. She does not cry, though her eyes shine with the sheen of nearly spilled tears. She simply nods once, thanks the fire, the smoke, the pouch, the plants, and the woman who lives beyond the trees, and then settles back into her seat, her hands folded, her breathing calm at last. But beyond the walls of that humble home, across fields now cloaked in dusk, and beneath skies heavy with stars not yet visible, illness still stirs, creeping from barn to barn, from mouth to hand, from one warm body to another, waiting for new lungs to fill, new skin to invade, new hearts to still. For this is but one evening in a long history of pain and persistence, and though this fire may burn bright, there are others that flicker low, in homes where no pouch was delivered, no charm tied, no remedy prepared. And it is toward one of those homes that we now turn, where the sick are not soothed by herbs or prayers, but by the crude hands of another kind of healer, one who does not ask the plants for permission, but reaches instead for blade and bowl, for leeches and lances, believing that the blood must flow if death is to be held at bay, even if, in the end, it is the healer himself who hastens its arrival. Not every healer walked gently through the world, coaxing remedies from the wild woods or whispering wisdom into the boiling haze of herbal brews. Some did not wait for plants to work their quiet, invisible magic, nor trust in the soft rustle of sacred charms or protection of rosemary smoke. In other homes, those without the coin for an apothecary's tinctures or the favor of a nearby wise woman, help came in a much colder form, wrapped not in linen pouches, but in blades and horn cups, in brass bowls and rough leather belts, and offered by men who believed with solemn certainty that the key to life lay in the ebb and flow of blood. And so it was that, in a low house at the edge of a different village, just as night began to settle its weight upon the crooked rooftops, another man lay sweating in his bed, while preparations were made for what was thought by some to be the only hope that remained, the letting of blood. The room is colder here, not from weather, but from silence. There is no fire burning, only the dull glow of a single tallow candle, its wax melting in thick drips down a crooked holder fashioned from pewter. The man on the bed is younger than the one we left behind, but he looks older, his cheeks sunken, his lips pale, his eyes half closed, as if watching some far-off scene only he can see. His breathing is rapid, and his skin slick with the kind of sweat that clings like oil. A woman kneels beside him, his sister perhaps, or wife. It does not matter now, for she is too afraid to speak, too still to cry. And beside her stands a figure not dressed in robes or herbs, but in a dark apron, his sleeves rolled, his hand steady as stone. He is not cruel, not uncaring, but practical, hardened by years of seeing too many men die too slowly, and he carries with him a kit that clinks faintly as he kneels, unrolling its contents with a precision that speaks not of fear, but of habit. Laid out on the cloth are the tools of his trade, a slender lancet with a finely honed tip, a small metal bowl darkened by age, a length of cord for tying the arm tight, and a pouch that shifts and rides ever so slightly when touched, as though something inside still lives, because something does. Leeches, fat and black and silent, waiting in their cool darkness for the chance to feed, not out of malice, but instinct. Their usefulness praised by men who believed that illness came not from rot or infection, but from an excess, a surplus, a flooding of the body's inner balances that needed only to be drained for a peace to return. The healer, or more accurately, the practitioner, ties the cord tightly around a man's upper arm, just above the elbow, and watches as the veins begin to swell with pressure. He speaks a few words, not a comfort, but a procedure. It will be quick. Do not move. The woman at the bedside holds her breath as he places a lancet against the tender crook of the man's arm and presses down, not with violence, but with resolve, and the skin parts with a soft resistance, like fruit peeled too early. Blood wells up immediately, dark and slow, and trickles into the waiting bowl. The man stirs slightly, groans, but does not resist. His strength is far too gone for that, and so the blood is let 1 ounce, then 2, the practitioner watching carefully, his face unreadable, his mind occupied not by doubt or regret, but by numbers, by balance, by the ancient diagrams etched into his memory, the ones showing which veins open for which ailment, which humors to target and release. He does not see sickness as something with name or shape, but as a storm inside the body, a tempest of hot and cold, dry and wet, bile and blood and vapors. To him, this blood is the flood that must recede. If it flows enough, if the pressure breaks, then perhaps the soul will settle and the body findeth harmony once again. When enough has been drawn, or at least, when a man grows pale and slack in the limbs, the healer presses a watercloth to the wound and binds it in place with twine. He then reaches into his pouch and removes 2 leeches, setting them carefully upon the man's other arm. They are slow at first, sluggish from the cold, but they soon awaken, anchoring themselves with soft, wet mouths and beginning their ancient, patient work. Their tiny teeth, shaped perfectly by nature for piercing flesh, latch on without fanfare, and the man shudders faintly, though whether from pain or cold or simply the closeness of death, it is hard to tell. The healer watches as the leeches begin to swell, their glossy bodies plumping with each slow draw of blood. until they resemble dark grapes ready to burst. The sister or wife turns her face away. She does not cry, not yet. Tears come later, when the hands are still and the silence deeper than before. For now, she simply watches the healer clean his tools, pack his kit, and rise. He offers no reassurance. This is not his place. He has done what was called for, what he was trained to do by the master who taught him, and by the text passed down, copied and recopied until the edges frayed and the words smudged with the sweat of too many worried hands. He leaves behind a cooling bowl of blood, two fattened leeches slowly detaching, and a man whose fate is now in a balance. Drained not just of illness, but of strength, his body emptied in the hope that the storm within is past. Outside, the night deepens. A fog has crept in from the fields, thick and soft, wrapping the village in a quiet, muffled stillness. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls once, its voice low and hollow like a warning. And somewhere else in another home, a different kind of healer prepares a different kind of treatment. Not with blades or leeches, but with charts and candles, watching the movement of planets across parchment to find signs of sickness written not in the body, but in the stars. For there were many ways to read the signs in these times. Many theories, many hopes, and many hands reaching into the darkness, trying to find the cause behind every fever, every cough, every cry in the night. And as the leeches are returned to their pouch, and the door creaks shut behind the bloodletter, the candlelight flickers and dims, as if echoing the dwindling breath of the man upon the bed, while overhead, the stars begin their silent dance, tracing paths that others believe will tell them not only how the man will fare, but why he ever fell ill to begin with. As the candle burns low in that small, dim cottage, its wax nearly spent and its flames shivering with each soft gust that creeps through the cracked wooden shutters, there exists an invisible bridge between the flickering light of that room and a different place altogether, one far removed from the worn floorboards and blood-stained bowls, where the air smells not of smoke and sweat, but of ink, vellum, and the dry, musty breath of old books. In a chamber warmed not by fire alone, but by the quiet insistence of memory and learning, a man sits hunched beneath a window of colored glass, its panes dulled by years of dust, tracing symbols across a page with a quill that trembles faintly in his hand. He is a scholar, a physician of some repute, and though he wears robes and speaks Latin, his understanding of the human body is rooted not in what he sees before him, but in what is read, passed down from the ancients, guarded by the church, and recited like scripture in the schools of Salerno and Montpellier. Before him, open and worn, lies a thick volume, its spine cracked, its pages crinkled and darkened by the touch of countless fingers. It is Galen, the Roman physician whose thoughts, though spoken centuries earlier, are considered immutable truth in this age of flickering torches and prayerful medicine. Galen did not speak of cells or bacteria, of viruses or infection. He spoke of balance, of fluids, of humors, and it is this belief that the body is governed by four elemental substances that shapes the very world through which healers, barbers, monks, and mothers walk in their endless attempt to quiet the suffering of the sick. The four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each one tied not merely to the body, but to nature, to season, to temperament. Blood, hot and moist, belong to the spring and to those of sanguine disposition, lively, joyful, talkative. Phlegm, cold and moist, was winter's domain and brought with a calm, sluggish temperament. Yellow bile, hot and dry, ruled the summer and the choleric, the irritable, the restless. And black bile, cold and dry, belonged to autumn, to melancholy, to sorrow and silence. To be well was to be in balance. To be ill was to be imbalanced. For one humor to rise above the others, staining the soul and breaking the harmony of the flesh. The scholar leans back, his eyes dry from study, and lets his thoughts drift, through patients he has seen, through fevers and faintings, through coughs and sudden deaths. And in each one he has looked not for a cause, but for an excess. Too much blood, perhaps, or too little phlegm. It is a logic that feels ordered, circular, comforting even in its simplicity. For the body is a system of vessels and vapors. Then surely it can be drained, cooled, heated, purged, or soothed into rightness. If a man is feverish, he must have too much blood, open a vein. If he is lethargic, his body is damp with phlegm, administer hot, drying herbs. If he is angry, bile rules and make him vomit. If he is sorrowful, black bile clogs the spirit. Offer gentle laxatives and quiet walks through gardens. This philosophy is not just a theory, but a framework that dictates every aspect of medical care. It decides which foods are recommended and which must be avoided. Apples are moist and cooling, good for the choleric, dangerous for the phlegmatic. Wine is hot and dry, soothing for the melancholy, harmful to the sanguine. Doctors prescribe not just treatments, but diets, colors, and even music to restore humoral balance. A patient recovering from yellow bile might be advised to wear cool blue robes, eat cucumbers, and avoid loud company. Illness, in this way, becomes not merely a disruption of the body, but a disharmony of the soul, of temperament, of the very essence that makes one human. The people believe in the system not because they have seen it work, but because it is everywhere, on the lips of healers, in the sermons of priests, in the scribbles of monks copying ancient scrolls by candlelight. Even the church, wary of worldly knowledge, allows this system to persist, for it aligns with the notion that suffering is not random but moral, that the body, like the soul, must be cleansed and corrected. The bleeding bowl, the purgative potion, the hot compress, and the dietary chart, they all serve this greater narrative of order and divine reason. And so, in homes across the land, when a child coughs, a woman faints, or a man burns with fever, the question is always the same: which humor has risen? And the answer, though it varies, always points to some imbalance that must be restored. The remedies, brutal though they may be, vomiting, enemas, bloodletting, sweating, are not seen as violence, but as necessity. Pain is part of the cure, a sign that the body is being guided back toward rightness, like a wayward soul nudged back toward salvation. There are charts, beautiful, elaborate things painted on parchment and pinned to the walls of monasteries and noble homes alike, that show how the stars, too, influence the humors. Saturn, cold and slow, brings phlegm. Mars, hot and angry, stirs the bile. Physicians consult these before administering treatment, for even the blood must flow at the proper phase of the moon. A bleeding done under the wrong constellation might only make the illness worse. And so time itself bends to this belief. Days are not merely days. They are vessels of movement of humors, the turning of the great celestial wheel. But for all its elegance, its symmetry, its reassuring order, the theory of the four humors is no match for the reality of disease. When the plague arrives, with its boils and its blackened limbs, no amount of balancing the body's fluids seems to slow its march. When a fever burns too hot or a wound festers too deep, the humors offer little comfort, and even the most devout practitioner must sometimes admit that the balance has failed. Still, the system endures, not because it cures, but because it explains. And in a world so full of uncertainty, explanation is often more soothing than truth. The scholar closes his book, his fingers lingering on the cracked leather cover, and lets out a slow breath. Outside his window, the night deepens. Somewhere in the village below, a candle is extinguished and another fever takes hold. Somewhere, a mother dips a cloth in vinegar and lays it on her child's head. Somewhere, a barber sharpens his blade. And somewhere else, a monk prepares a potion meant to calm the bile and draw out the phlegm, murmuring Latin as though each word might bind the body tighter to the soul. And as the stars begin their slow ascent above the rooftops, watched by those who believe they govern not only fate but flesh, we turn now to a place where medicine and mercy meet beneath the shadow of the cross, where illness is not only treated, but witnessed, mourned, and prayed over, where the sick lie side by side in long rows, tended not by doctors, but by those who had chosen to serve both God and man in quiet. Aching halls of the medieval hospital, the bells toll slowly, their hollow voices rising into the night sky like unanswered questions, each chime rippling outward into the silence, into the fields, into the hearts of those who have come to expect little comfort from their echoes. Somewhere beyond the village, past the crooked stone bridge and the stream that runs black and slow beneath the ivy-covered arches, there lies a building of pale gray stone and heavy wooden doors, its roof patched in places with moss and lichen, and its windows narrow, shaped like slits through which only the dimmest sunlight can pass. It is a hospital, not as we know it now, not filled with bustling wards of physicians in starched linen, but rather a solemn sanctuary where the sick are brought not to be cured, but to be kept to be watched, to be eased gently toward either recovery or release through prayer, ritual, and the constant, hovering presence of death. Within its walls, the air hangs heavy, thick with the mingled smells of tallow smoke, damp straw, and the iron scent of illness. It is quieter here than in the village homes, though not because there is less suffering. In fact, there is more bodies lying upon narrow pallets, more coughs that scrape against the stone, more fevered mutterings and shallow gasps. But the noise of struggle is subdued by the weight of reverence, for this is a place held in the hand of God, where those who tend the sick do so not as doctors, but as servants of a higher will. Their hands are folded more often in prayer than in work, and their remedies are as much sacrament as science. The patients lie in long rows, each on a low wooden frame covered in straw and rough blankets, spaced just far enough apart that the groans of one do not drown out the silence of another. Some moan in delirium, eyes wide and unseeing, limbs twitching in dreams that no one dares interpret. Others lie still, their breath a barely perceptible flutter, their skin drawn tight across bone, their souls balanced precariously at the edge of departure. Between them move the brothers and sisters of the order, nuns in plain habits, monks with sandal feet and downcast eyes, carrying bowls of broth, clean cloths, and in some cases, holy relics wrapped in linen, believed to draw the sickness from flesh as surely as sun draws steam from soil. No one here speaks of cures. The word itself is heavy, too hopeful, too fragile to survive in these sacred halls. Instead, they speak of easing pain, of lessening fever, of bringing peace. A patient who dies calmly is praised. One who claws at the air and curses his God is prayed for even more. The body is tended, yes, but the soul is watched more closely. A priest moves steadily between the rows, his fingers often wet with holy water, his voice never rising, never falling, a continuous stream of Latin supplications whispered over brows slick with sweat. Confession is offered to those who can still speak. For those who cannot, absolution is given with the gentlest of touches, a thumb against the forehead, a cross drawn in trembling air. Along one wall is the infirmarium's apothecary table, though it is a modest affair. No gleaming instruments, no rows of glass bottles, only a few wooden boxes containing dried herbs, a mortar and pestle, and a small collection of scrolls, copied over decades by tired hands under candlelight. Remedies are prepared with care, often infused with scripture. A tea made from camphor and betony might be given for stomach pain, a poultice of plantain, and vinegar for sores, but the effectiveness of these treatments is secondary to the ritual itself. Medicine, here, is not only a means of healing the flesh, but of honoring the sacred duty to care for the suffering, to stand vigil over those whose lives hang by threads finer than a spider's web. Occasionally, a cry breaks the hush, a child, feverish and afraid, or an old man in the grip of night terrors. But each sound is absorbed by the building itself, swallowed into its cold stones like prayers into the sky. No one is turned away here, but not all who arrive are meant to leave. Some are carried in by loved ones and laid down with final kisses pressed to their foreheads, and those who carry them leave quickly, not looking back. To remain is to bear witness to sorrow, and many cannot. Those who stay, the brothers, the sisters, have long since learned to live with loss, to bury the dead with gentle hands and heavy hearts, to light candles that flicker like hopes too weak to stand against the wind. Above the central ward hangs a crucifix, worn smooth with age, its wooden Christ gazing downward, not in judgment, but in silence. Beneath it, a nun kneels beside a girl no older than 12, her hands folded tightly as she whispers a prayer into the space between life and death. The girl's breathing is shallow, her face waxen, her small frame barely shifting beneath the blanket. The nun's lips do not tremble, though her eyes glisten with unshed tears. She does not know the child's name, nor her family's story, but she prays with fervor born not of hope, but of duty, of love rendered through repetition, through hours spent watching one soul after another slip silently away. Outside, the wind rises. It whistles gently through the cracks in the walls, brushing over the faces of the sleeping, the dying, the praying, and for a moment it seems to carry with it the voices of those already gone, quiet, lingering sighs that echo in the rafters and fade into the dark corners. A brother pauses in his steps, glancing upward, and then continues, cradling a bowl of steaming broth that will not be eaten, but will be left at the bedside as a gesture, a final kindness. For kindness endures here, even when medicine fails. Somewhere down the corridor, a bell is rung. Not the great bell that calls to mass, but the small one that signifies a passing. One of the nuns moves to the doorway and bows her head. No one rushes. Death is not a stranger here, nor an interruption. It is a familiar presence, seated always at the edge of the room, watching and waiting, patient and still. The dead will be washed, their bodies wrapped in linen, and a candle will be lit at their feet. They will be buried at dawn in the earth behind the chapel, and their names will be added to the long list of souls remembered during evening prayer. And even as one candle is lit in remembrance, another is being extinguished at the far end of the hall, where a different kind of practitioner enters, a man with sharper tools, a more pragmatic manner, and a kit made not of scripture and sacrament, but of razors, hooks, and stiff brushes. He is a barber surgeon, summoned for a wound that festers despite all prayers, and he carries within the cold efficiency of steel and vinegar the knowledge that if the flesh cannot be soothed, it must be cut, scraped, or burned away. The clinking of iron tools in a linen wrap breaks the quiet in the far end of the corridor, where candlelight flickers more warily now, and even the nuns seem to step back slightly, their faces pulled into gentle masks of concern as the barber surgeon passes. He is not one of them, nor is he truly of the learned medical guilds. No university in Salerno or Bologna boasts his name in its rolls. No bishop seal is affixed to his treatments. He exists in that narrow space between necessity and fear, summoned when wounds putrefy, when bones splinter through skin, when rock creeps too close a heart, and when the soothing words of prayer can no longer delay the grim march of decay. He is a man with red stains beneath his fingernails and eyes that have seen too many limbs severed in haste, yet too few recoveries to count them among triumphs. He walks with the gait of someone accustomed to being summoned too late. His boots are worn, his cloak rough, and the satchel slung across his shoulder hangs heavy with the weight of iron, horn, and tightly packed cloth. Inside it lies his world, small knives with curved, narrow blades meant to probe wounds, forceps fashioned from bone and brass, a saw whose teeth have dulled not from disuse, but from too much, and a roll of wax thread for closing what he can, when he can. There is also a cautery iron, blackened at the tip and kept in a separate pouch, its heat and hiss reserved for when there is no other path left but fire. The room he enters is already thick with a coppery smell of infection, a scent that crawls low along the floor and clings to the stones. The patient lies still, barely conscious, his leg grotesquely swollen and wrapped in sodden linen that has long since ceased to absorb anything. The skin around the wound is discolored, dark as dried plums, and when the cloth is gently peeled away, a slickness rises from beneath. Pus, thick and yellow-white, mixed with blood and something darker still. The barber surgeon does not flinch. He has seen worse. He always sees worse. A young monk stands nearby with a candle and a bowl of water, his hands trembling slightly, though whether from fear or reverence is hard to say. The surgeon nods once, brusquely, and begins his work. There is no ceremony, no prayer, only preparation. He lays out his instruments in a line upon a clean cloth, tests the edge of a small knife with his thumb, and reaches into his pouch for a lump of dried herbs soaked in strong wine. This he presses to the patient's lips, coaxing a few drops into the mouth. It is not meant to dull the pain entirely. Nothing can, but it may soften the edge of it, just enough to keep the man from screaming himself hoarse. The leg must come off. There is no alternative. Gangrene has already set in, and the flesh, soft to the touch and darkening by the hour, has begun to turn sweet, a sweetness no living limb should carry. The surgeon wraps a leather strap around the thigh, high above the wound, and pulls it tight, using a small wooden rod to twist it further until blood flow is reduced. The monk holds the patient's shoulders down, whispering softly as though his words might carry the soul upward even before the body fails. Then the knife, a single, clean incision through the skin and muscle, just above the rot. The surgeon's hands move quickly, not roughly, but without hesitation, cutting through layers that slide away like cloth in water. There is blood, though less than might be expected, thanks to the tourniquet. Then the saw. It whines as it moves back and forth through bone, the sound sharp and terrible, echoing in the chamber like a scream. The patient does not wake. Whether he is too far gone or blessedly unaware is unclear. When the limb is finally free, It drops into a bowl lined with cloth, and the surgeon wastes no time. He presses a heated iron to the stump, the hiss and smoke rising together in a single violent sigh, and the scent that follows is unmistakable, burned flesh, bitter and thick, curling around the senses like fog. The monk crosses himself, eyes wide, but does not look away. The wound is bound tightly, the cloth soaked in wine and sealed with resin, and the body is turned gently to its side. Nothing more can be done. The removed leg is wrapped in linen and taken quietly away, to be buried with dignity or burned in private, depending on the customs of the house. The patient survives the night. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they do not. But the work of the barber surgeon is not to promise life, only to delay death's reach where he can, to cut away what cannot be saved in the hope that something might remain. Outside the chamber, the halls return to their hushed rhythm. The nuns resume their quiet prayers, the monks their slow steps, and another soul in another room begins to fade, their breath growing shallow, their eyes glassy with the distant gaze of one who no longer sees what's before them. The surgeon packs his tools in silence, wipes his hands on a cloth darkened by too many uses, and nods once to the monk before disappearing down the hall, his boots echoing softly on the stone as he vanishes into the flickering shadows. And somewhere far from this place, in another village lit only by hearthlight and moon, a group of townspeople gather around a man not for surgery, not for prayer, but for ritual, for illness is not always understood as a thing of blood and flesh. Sometimes it is believed to be a spirit, a curse, a punishment for sins committed in secret. And sometimes, when medicine fails and even the barber's saw brings no relief, people turn not to herbs or saints or steel, but to something older, darker, and far more desperate. There are nights when the wind seems to speak, not with words, but with a long, low murmur, something older than language, a tone that presses against the windows, stirs the trees in restless movements, and causes even the strongest candles to flicker with unease. In villages far from the reach of stone hospitals and the clipped words of learned physicians, where the forest still presses in close and the stars hang heavy above without names or explanations, illness is not always seen as a thing that grows in the gut or blooms on the skin. It is not always a consequence of imbalance or a failing of the flesh. Sometimes it is a visitation, a punishment, a mark left by the unseen. In such places, when a child cries out in the night with burning skin and staring eyes, or when a man begins to speak in tongues no one understands, his voice dry and deep like the sound of cracked earth, it is not to the apothecary or the surgeon that the villagers turn. Instead, they gather beneath the pale moonlight, in fields or barns, in corners of churches long since forgotten, and whisper curses of spirits, of wrongs done that must now be righted before the sickness spreads like a shadow from one soul to the next. For in the dark spaces between understanding, fear makes it home, and fear needs no proof to flourish. A house stands on the edge of such a village, low-roofed and lopsided, its chimney bent like an old spine, its door marked with a cross made of ash. Inside, a family crouches beside a bed where a father lies still, his chest barely rising, his face slick with fever, his limbs curled in upon themselves as though trying to hide from something unseen. They have tried the herbs, the broths, the poultices made from elderflower and foxglove. They have burned rosemary and sprinkled blessed water on the beams above the door. Nothing has changed. The illness clings like a second skin, refusing to loosen its grip. Now, in desperation, they have called upon another kind of healer. If healer is the right word at all, she is old, older even than Grana from the earlier village, and her presence is marked by silence more than sound. She does not knock when she arrives, but enters as though she was always meant to. Her clothes are colorless, shapeless, and she carries no bag of tools or herbs, only a bundle of dried twigs and a pouch of salt. Her eyes are pale, not blind, but so light they seem almost empty, and when she speaks, it is in a voice so quiet that one must lean close to hear. But the room listens. Even the wind outside seems to pause. The woman does not ask what the symptoms are. She does not need to. She looks once at the man on the bed, then turns her gaze to the rafters, the hearth, the shadows in the corners of the room. She walks slowly, her fingers brushing against the walls, as though searching not for dust, but for something darker, an echo, a residue, a stain not of blood, but of spirit. She stops at the threshold, where the door hangs slightly open and murmurs something that is not quite Latin and not quite the local tongue. Her words are thick with age, their meanings unclear, and yet their purpose feels heavy in the air. From her pouch, she scatters salt in a circle around the bed, then arranges her bundle of twigs at the four corners of the room. She lights each one with a taper taken from the hearth, and the smoke they release is sharp and biting, bitter as wormwood and thick as fog. The family begins to cough, but the woman does not move. She stands at the foot of the bed and begins to chant. Her voice is low, rhythmic, without melody, but full of weight. It is a calling out, or perhaps a calling in, an attempt to speak across the boundary between what is seen and what is not. As the smoke thickens, the man on the bed begins to writhe. Not violently, but slowly, as though something inside him is turning over, waking. His lips part, and he mutters words no one recognizes. His eyes open wide, and for a moment, they do not seem to see anything at all. The woman does not stop. She continues to speak, her hands moving in slow circles, her fingers slicing the air as if drawing symbols that only she can understand. To those watching, it is unclear whether what they see is healing or harm. There is no clear line between ritual and illusion, only the moment, thick with breath and fear, and the hope that something, anything, might ease the suffering that has taken root in their home. The woman's chant rises slightly, then fades again, and with it, the smoke begins to lessen, curling upward toward the rafters, drawn away like breath from a dying fire. When she is finished, she does not speak. She gathers her pouch, stamps out the burning twigs, and walks in the house as silently as she entered. The family does not follow. They remain still, unsure whether what has passed was blessing or curse. The man on the bed lies quiet now, his breathing shallow but steady. Perhaps he will wake in the morning. Perhaps not. But the air feels different, emptier, lighter, as though something that once dwelled here has taken its leave. This is not an uncommon tale. Across the countryside, there are countless such stories, of fevers that lifted after curses were broken, of children who stopped screaming once a charm was buried at the crossroads, of warts cured with whispered names and stolen rainwater, of deaths that only came after certain relics were removed from the home. Whether these stories hold truth or not hardly matters. In an age without certainty, belief itself is a kind of medicine. Even within the walls of the church, there are those who understand the power of these rituals, though they would never call them such. Exorcisms are performed, not often, but with a seriousness that acknowledges their weight. Illness is sometimes seen as a sign of possession, especially when the symptoms defy explanation. A girl who convulses, speaks in strange tongues, and stares with blank, unblinking eyes may be treated not with herbs, but with incense, crucifixes, and hours of prayer. And when at last she lies still, whether from exhaustion or peace, the priest proclaims the demon banished, and the congregation breathes again. And yet, for every ritual that seems to bring relief, there are dozens that end in silence. The sick die, the prayers go unanswered, and the world turns on. But the memory of the ritual remains, and with it, the belief that perhaps, just perhaps, it might work next time, that the spirit might be driven out, the curse lifted, the illness eased. As night deepens and the winds once again rise to their lonely murmuring, we move now toward yet another place of mystery, a place where sickness is not fear for its agony or its closeness to death, but for its stain, a place where those afflicted are not treated or prayed over, but removed, cast out, hidden away behind high walls and silent gates, a place where the sick are not the dying, but the dangerous, the lepers, in the shadow of a towering hill, where the forest thins and the land slopes gently down toward a dark and sluggish river. There sits a small cluster of crumbling stone buildings, half hidden beneath creeping ivy and the overgrowth of wild blackberry bushes. The air here is colder, heavier, and carries a faint scent of earth and decay, mingled with a faint, persistent aroma of herbs hung to dry in smoke from small hearth fires. This is a leper house, the Lazar house, a place both feared and pitied, where those marked by the cruel touch of disease live apart from the world that once held their names and faces. The path leading to the leper house winds through thorny thickets and past withered trees, their branches bent low as if weighed down by invisible burdens. Travelers avoid it when they can, hurrying past with eyes cast downward, whispering prayers and crossing themselves in silent hope that they will never know the fate of those who dwell within. For leprosy is not merely a sickness. It is a sentence, a mark of uncleanliness, of divine punishment, and a fate worse than death in the eyes of medieval society. Inside the walls, the world is bleak and slow. Stone cottages with narrow windows offer little warmth, and the cold seeps deep into the bones of those who live here. The inhabitants move with care, their faces hidden beneath rough hoods or veils, their hands twisted by disease, their skin mottled and scarred in ways that tell stories too painful for words. They do not speak loudly. Their voices are soft, carried low like wind through the trees. Their days are marked by routines. Simple meals of coarse bread and weak broth, prayers muttered beneath cracked lips, and the ceaseless task of tending wounds that never truly heal. The leper's life is one of loneliness and sorrow, not only because of the disease itself, but because of the isolation forced upon them by a world that fears contamination above all else. They are watched from afar, barred from markets and churches, their presence announced by the clatter of wooden clappers, small rattles that they carry to warn others of their approach. The sound is both a caution and a lament, a reminder that they walk among the living yet belong to another realm entirely. Yet despite this bleakness, there is a fragile community here, held together by shared fate and quiet compassion. The brothers and sisters of the religious order that oversee the Lazar house move among the sick with tender hands, offering bread and water, bandaging sores, and whispering prayers that are sometimes the only balm left. They know that medicine has little power over leprosy. No salve or bloodletting can halt its slow, cruel progression. Instead, they offer presence, an acknowledgement that the afflicted are still human, still deserving of care and dignity in a world that too often forgets both. At the center of the courtyard stands a small chapel, its stone walls worn smooth by the hands of countless souls seeking comfort. Within, a single candle burns endlessly before a carved statue of St. Lazarus, the patron of lepers, whose own story is one of death and resurrection, suffering and hope. Here, the inhabitants gather not only to pray for deliverance, but to find a measure of peace amid their pain, a momentary escape from the relentless march of disease and despair. The hours pass slowly, each one filled with small acts of endurance, the turning of a page in a worn prayer book, the careful stitching of a threadbare garment, the soft crooning of a hymn that drifts through the air like a fragile bird. Outside, the wind carries the distant toll of bells and the murmur of villagers who live just beyond the walls, their lives untouched yet forever shadowed by the presence of the leper house. And so, life continues here, an existence caught between worlds, between health and sickness, belonging in exile, hope and despair. It is a testament to resilience of the human spirit, even when faced with the harshest of realities, and a reminder that the grim truths of medieval medicine were not only about pain and death, but also about the small, quiet acts of care that sought to soften both. As the sun dips below the horizon and the first stars appear, the inhabitants settle into the long night, wrapped in coarse blankets and the soft glow of oil lamps. Somewhere, a prayer rises, slow and steady, weaving through the stillness and into the dark. And as sleep comes, fragile and fleeting, it offers a brief reprieve from the harsh world outside, a momentary balm for weary bodies and souls. As the seasons turn, the years slip past like shadows across the ancient stones of countless villages, towns, and cities. The fragile equilibrium upon which medieval life depended began to unravel in ways no one could have foreseen. In quiet corners of the known world, whispers of a new terror travel on the winds, an invisible enemy unlike any before, swift and cruel, indifferent to prayer or bloodletting, sweeping through populations with the cold efficiency of a winter storm. It was a scourge that would come to be known as the Black Death, a plague that darkened the doorways of homes and cloisters alike, and changed forever the understanding of sickness, death, and the fragile boundary between them. The first signs were subtle: a sudden chill, a fleeting fever, a swelling bump beneath the skin, often mistaken for a bruise or insect bite. But within days, the symptoms grew harsh and unmistakable. The swellings, called buboes, blossomed in the groin, the armpits, behind the ears, hard, painful, and darkening with a dreadful hue that earned the disease its name. The afflicted would grow weak, their skin flushed with fever, their breaths coming short and ragged. Some were overtaken by violent coughing fits. the sound harsh and rattling, while others succumbed to spasms and delirium, their minds lost to fevered dreams and shadows. Across Europe, the plague moved like a shadowed tide, unstoppable and unforgiving. Ports once bustling with trade became ghost towns, ships anchored in silent harbors, their crews dead or fled. Market squares emptied, shops shuttered, and streets grew quiet beneath the weight of fear. No village was spared, no town too small, no city too fortified. It swept through all layers of society, the noble and the peasant, the merchant and the monk, leaving behind a trail of despair and death. Medical practitioners found themselves powerless. The wisdom of the ancients, the careful balance of humors, the prayers and rituals, all were revealed to be inadequate defenses against this merciless foe. Physicians donned mask stuffed with aromatic herbs, hoping to ward off the miasma. Foul air believed to carry disease. They carried posies of flowers and spices, wrapped their faces in cloth, and fled when they could. The barber surgeons, who had wielded saws and knives with grim resolve, were overwhelmed by the sheer number of the sick. Hospitals, those quiet places of vigil and prayer, became overcrowded, their walls echoing with cries and silence in equal measure. Fear gave way to panic and suspicion. Some whispered that the plague was punishment from God, a wrath for the sins of humanity. Others blamed outsiders, strangers, heretics, even entire communities, fanning the flames of hatred and violence. Jewish populations were persecuted, accused falsely of poisoning wells, their homes burned, their lives taken in brutal acts of cruelty. The plague, in its cruelty, not only took bodies but fractured societies, sowing seeds of fear that would bear bitter fruit for generations. Amid this darkness, human responses were as varied as they were desperate. Some turned inward, seeking solace in solitude and prayer, locking themselves away from the world that seemed to rot beneath their feet. Others abandoned reason entirely, indulging in wild processions, flagellants who marched through streets, whipping their backs in penance, hoping to appease divine fury through blood and pain. The air was thick with smoke from burning herbs, with the cries of the dying and with the weight of a world unmoored from its foundations. The dead were too many to bury properly. Mass graves were dug hastily beyond city walls, bodies thrown in like refuse, prayers hurried or forgotten altogether. The living lived in terror. Each cough a herald of doom, each knock at the door summons to despair. Families were torn apart, neighbors vanished without a trace, and the very earth seemed soaked with grief. Yet, amid this devastation, threads of resilience endured. Some communities found ways to care for their own despite fear, setting up quarantines, caring for the sick in isolated houses, sharing what little they had. Physicians, even when helpless, documented symptoms and courses of the disease, laying foundations for future understanding. And slowly, very slowly, the plague began to recede, leaving behind a world forever changed, where old certainties had been shattered and new ways of thinking about medicine, disease, and human frailty were beginning to emerge, like fragile shoots pushing through scorched earth. As night falls and stars wheel overhead, we leave behind the mass graves and deserted streets, turning now to the gradual dawn after the darkness, where healing, discovery, and the slow journey toward understanding will take root amid the ruins of the past, and where the grim reality of medieval medicine begins to give way to new hope. As the black shroud of the plague slowly lifted from the lands of Europe, leaving behind a landscape scarred with loss yet fertile with the possibility of change, the survivors began to gather themselves from the ashes of devastation and rebuild not only their homes and fields, but also their understanding of health and healing. The grim reality of medieval medicine, once so tightly bound to ancient texts, superstition, and the fragile balance of humors, began to show cracks where new ideas would seep through, whispers of slow but steady transformation in the way sickness was seen, studied, and treated. This transformation did not happen all at once, nor did it erase the shadows of the past immediately, but it set in motion a process that would eventually lead to a more scientific approach to medicine, one rooted in observation, anatomy, and the careful recording of knowledge. The first seeds of this renewal were planted in the very institutions that had endured the plague's relentless assault, the hospitals. Though their role had been primarily one of sanctuary and prayer, the sheer scale of suffering had forced them to adapt. The overcrowded halls and the echoing silence of death gave way, over decades, to spaces more organized and structured, places where care was not only spiritual but also practical. New rules were written, emphasizing cleanliness, separation of the sick by symptoms, and the need for ongoing care, however limited the resources. Some hospitals began to appoint staff with specialized knowledge, men and women who were not just caregivers or religious servants, but individuals with training in the use of herbs, in managing wounds, and in understanding the patterns of illness. Simultaneously, the great universities of Europe, Salerno, Bologna, Montpellier, and Paris, grew in prominence as centers for the study of medicine. Scholars, many of whom had traveled far and wide, gathered texts not only from the classical Roman and Greek traditions, but also from Arabic scholars whose writings, rich with new observations and medical insights, had been preserved and translated during the centuries of Islamic learning. These Arabic texts introduced European physicians to new ideas about anatomy, pharmacology, and the functioning of the body, challenging the old reliance on humoral theory alone. It was in these halls, often dim and filled with the scent of parchment and candle wax, that dissections began to be performed, albeit rarely and under strict conditions, allowing students to glimpse the workings of muscles, bones, and organs rather than rely solely on texts. The study of anatomy marked a quiet revolution. Where once the body was a mysterious vessel governed by unseen humors, it now began to be seen as a physical structure, something that could be studied, mapped, and understood. Pioneers such as Mondino de Luzzi in the early 14th century performed public dissections that attracted both students and curious onlookers, marking a break from centuries of taboo. The discovery that some classical teachings were mistaken or incomplete challenged the authority of ancient texts and encouraged a new spirit of inquiry. Alongside these academic advances, medical practice began to diversify. Apothecaries, once little more than sellers of herbs and spices, grew into specialized craftsmen who experimented with the blending of remedies. Careful in their measurement and preparation, their shops, filled with jars of dried roots, powders, and balms, became places where new formulas were developed, combining both old knowledge and fresh experimentation. Some of these remedies, though often still rooted in superstition, showed genuine effects, pain relief, antiseptic properties, or soothing qualities that slowly built the foundation for pharmacology. The role of physicians also evolved. No longer were they simply arbiters of humoral balance or dispensers of prayer and bloodletting. Increasingly, they observed their patients carefully, took detailed notes of symptoms, and sometimes recorded the outcomes of their treatments, building casebooks that serve as early medical records. This methodical approach laid the groundwork for evidence-based medicine, even if many treatments remained ineffective or harmful by modern standards. The influence of the Church, which had long been both a protector and gatekeeper of medical knowledge, began to shift as well. While monasteries and convents continued to provide care and maintain libraries of medical texts, the rise of universities led to a greater separation between spiritual care and medical science. Yet the Church remained a powerful force, and many physicians were also clerics. Their work balanced between faith and reason. This duality shaped much of medieval medicine's complexity, a world where miracles and medicines coexisted uneasily. At the same time, public health measures began to emerge, inspired by the horror of the plague. Cities instituted quarantine laws, isolating ships and travelers for weeks before allowing entry, a practice derived from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40 days. Waste disposal, water supply, and urban sanitation became subject to concern, though progress was slow and uneven. The understanding that diseases could spread from person to person, though not fully comprehended, led to the first tentative steps toward what would centuries later become epidemiology. Even with these advances, the journey toward modern medicine was long and winding. Superstition and humoral theory still held sway in many places. Bloodletting and purging remained common treatments. Yet the emergence of hospitals dedicated not only to the dying but also to the convalescent, the growth of medical schools, and the slow accumulation of practical knowledge laid the foundation for the centuries to come. As twilight settled softly over the ancient cities, casting long shadows across cobblestones and cathedral spires, we can almost hear the faint murmur of students in lecture halls, the scratching of quills on parchment, and the whispered prayers of patients finding new hope in the slow dawn of understanding. Medicine, though still imperfect and sometimes cruel, began to step out of the darkened halls of superstition and into the light of observation and learning. And so, as the stars wheel overhead and the world turns quietly in its endless dance, we pause for a moment on the threshold of change, where the grim reality of medieval medicine begins its slow transformation, propelled by curiosity, resilience, and the unyielding human desire to heal. The slow unfolding of new ideas in medieval medicine found its champions among those few who dare to look beyond the inherited texts in common practice, whose names would echo through the centuries not merely for their learning, but for their courage to question, to observe, and to push the boundaries of understanding. These figures, scattered across Europe and the Mediterranean, embodied the fragile bridge between the old world of humors, prayers, and rituals and the dawning age of empirical inquiry and anatomical study. One such figure was the Italian physician and anatomist Mondino de Luzzi, who lived in the early 14th century. Though his work still bore the marks of tradition, Mondino is remembered as a pioneer for his public dissections in Bologna, a city that held one of the oldest universities dedicated to medical study. In a time when the dissection of human bodies was taboo, sometimes forbidden by religious and cultural strictures, Mondino's lectures, performed on cadavers carefully prepared and displayed, offered a rare glimpse beneath the skin, into the very workings of flesh and bone. His book, Anatomia, became a cornerstone text for medical students for centuries to come, bridging the gap between ancient authority and direct observation. Mondino's work, while groundbreaking for its time, was but one thread in a larger tapestry woven by scholars from many lands. In the Islamic world, physicians such as Avicenna or Ibn Sina, whose canon of medicine synthesized centuries of Greek, Roman, and Arabic medical knowledge, provided European scholars with richly detailed insights into diseases, treatments, and the workings of the body. Avicenna's writings, translated into Latin and studied across European universities, emphasize the importance of clinical observation and careful diagnosis, encouraging a more systematic approach to medicine than had previously prevailed. Closer to Renaissance, the Flemish anatomist Andreas Vesalius would build upon these foundations with even greater daring, challenging centuries of medical dogma with detailed, illustrated anatomical texts based on his own dissections. But before Vesalius, there were many who laid the groundwork, many who took tentative steps into shadows of the unknown with a flickering light of curiosity as their guide. Medical practice itself began to diversify and professionalize. The once blurred lines between barber, surgeon, apothecary, and physician started to sharpen, each role developing its own traditions, knowledge, and responsibilities. Surgeons, who had long been seen as mere craftsmen or servants of physicians, began to earn recognition for their skill, especially in battlefield medicine and the treatment of wounds. Guilds formed to regulate their trade, training apprentices in techniques that combined both practical knowledge and increasing anatomical insight. Apothecaries, too, rose in importance, becoming centers of experimentation and innovation. Their shops, filled with exotic ingredients from distant lands, myrrh, cinnamon, camphor, offered remedies both familiar and strange. The preparation of medicines became more exacting, relying less on vague prescriptions and more on measured quantities and refined processes. Though many remedies still had roots in superstition, the gradual accumulation of successful treatments fostered a growing respect for the empirical aspects of healing. Among physicians' casebooks, detailed records of patients' symptoms, treatments, and outcomes became valuable tools for learning. These chronicles of illness and care represent some of the earliest forms of medical documentation, providing insight not only into diseases, but also into the experiences and thoughts of the healers themselves. They reveal a world of trial and error, of hope and failure, of science and faith intertwined in a complex dance. Education in medicine became more formalized as universities refined their curricula and examinations. Latin remained the language of instruction, allowing scholars across Europe to communicate and share knowledge despite the diversity of vernacular tongues. Students memorized texts by Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna, yet were encouraged increasingly to observe and question. This tension between tradition and innovation defined much of medieval and early Renaissance medicine. The Church's role, though still influential, began to shift subtly. While many physicians were themselves members of the clergy, the separation between spiritual care and medical science became more pronounced. Hospitals continued to serve as places of healing and refuge, but they also became centers for medical training and research. Monasteries remain repositories of knowledge, their scriptoria copying and preserving invaluable manuscripts, even as new ideas slowly took root outside their walls. And yet, despite these advances, medieval medicine remained far from modern standards. Bloodletting persisted as a common treatment, often applied indiscriminately. Quack remedies and superstition lingered in villages and cities alike. Plagues and epidemics continued to ravage populations. Their cause is still poorly understood. But in the lives and work of these pioneering figures, we see the fragile flicker of reason beginning to illuminate the darkness, the first steps toward medicine based on observation, evidence, and compassion. As twilight settles over the great halls of learning, and candles flicker low in the quiet study rooms, we remember the hands that dare to probe beneath the skin, the minds that question the unquestionable, and the voices that whispered of knowledge yet to come. The grim reality of medieval medicine was not simply one of suffering and ignorance, but also of resilience, curiosity, and the slow, steady journey toward understanding that would one day transform the art of healing forever. The world of medieval medicine, in all its complexity and contradiction, was as much defined by the treatments it offered as by the theories that underpinned them. As the centuries unfolded, a wide range of therapies and procedures came into common use, reflecting both the slow growth of medical knowledge and the stubborn persistence of older ideas, beliefs, and practices. The hands that wielded knives, the lips that recited prayers, and the jars filled with poultices and powders all played their parts in the delicate, often desperate dance of healing, hope, and suffering. Among the most common treatments was bloodletting, a practice as ancient as medicine itself, and deeply rooted in the belief that the body's health depended on the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. When illness struck, physicians and barber surgeons alike would often turn to the lancet or the leech, aiming to release what was thought to be excess blood or bad blood, in the hope of restoring harmony within. The procedure can involve opening a vein, sometimes in the arm or the foot, or applying leeches to the skin, their suckers drawing thick, dark blood from the patient's flesh. While sometimes relieving pressure or fever, bloodletting was frequently overused, weakening the patient further or hastening death in some cases, though the reason behind it was never questioned too deeply for fear of challenging established wisdom. Alongside bloodletting, purging was another widely employed remedy. Laxatives, enemas, and emetics, substances that induce vomiting, were administered with the goal of cleansing the body of toxins or harmful humors. These treatments could be harsh and exhausting, stripping the patient of strength and leaving them weak and dehydrated. Yet like bloodletting, purging was rarely abandoned. Its use deeply ingrained in the medical practices taught in universities and passed down through generations. Herbal medicine also held a central place in medieval healing. Apothecaries and physicians prepared remedies from an astonishing variety of plants, roots, barks, and flowers, many of which had real medicinal properties. Willow bark, for instance, contained salicin, a compound related to modern aspirin, and was used to ease pain and reduce fever. Herbs like lavender and rosemary were believed to purify the air and calm the nerves, while garlic was prized for its supposed ability to ward off infection and evil spirits alike. Yet many treatments were applied with little understanding of dosage or toxicity, and some herbs, like hemlock or belladonna, were deadly if misused. The mixing of ingredients often combined practical effects with magical or symbolic meanings: red plants for blood, bitter herbs for cleansing, fragrant flowers to please the spirits. Surgery, meanwhile, was a realm fraught with risk and pain, practiced mostly by barber surgeons who learned their craft through apprenticeship and experience rather than formal study. They dealt with the wounds of battle, accidents, and infections, performing amputations, draining abscesses, setting broken bones, and extracting teeth. Anesthesia as we know it did not exist, though alcohol, opium, and mandrake might dull sensation for a time. The surgeon's skill lay not only in cutting and stitching, but in swift, confident action, for delay could mean death. The instruments were simple but effective: knives, saws, hooks, forceps, and cautery irons for sealing wounds with burning metal to stop bleeding and prevent infection. Infections themselves were a constant and deadly companion to surgery. Without knowledge of germs or antiseptics, wounds often festered, turning black and swollen with pus, the hallmark of gangrene and sepsis. Patients might survive the initial operation only to succumb days later to fever and delirium. The smell of decay and the sight of swelling limbs were common in the surgeon's world, reminders that medicine was as often about damage control and palliation as about true healing. Beyond the physical, medieval medicine also attended to the mind and spirit, though these were often inseparable. Melancholy, anxiety, and what we might now call depression were believed to arise from imbalances in the humors or from spiritual afflictions. Treatments could include baths in fragrant waters, the use of soothing music or poetry, prayer, and even exorcisms in cases thought to be possession. The connection between body and soul was deeply felt, and healing one without the other was considered incomplete. Despite the limitations and often brutal nature of these treatments, patients placed their trust in healers, seeking relief from pain and hope for recovery. The social rituals surrounding illness, the visits, the prayers, the rituals performed at the bedside, offered comfort and a sense of control in an uncertain world. The healer's presence was itself a balm, a thread of connection between the suffering individual and the wider community. As night deepens, the flicker of candlelight casts long shadows on the walls of hospitals and homes, and the stories of patients and healers alike fold gently into the quiet of sleep. The grim reality of medieval medicine was a world where hope and despair danced closely, where science and superstition mingled, and where every cut, every poultice, and every prayer carried the weight of human frailty and resilience. The ancient rhythms of life and death were never more palpable than in the chambers where new life was brought into the world, where the cycles of birth and motherhood unfolded amid the harsh realities of medieval existence. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a profound event, both miraculous and perilous, deeply entwined with the fears, hopes, and beliefs that shaped the experience of women and families. It was a time when the very act of bringing a child into the world carried immense risks, not only to the mother and infant, but also to the fragile bonds that held communities and households together. In the quiet rooms of stone cottages and timbered homes, often warmed only by a hearth's flickering flame and the soft glow of tallow candles, a woman labored surrounded by those who would assist her, midwives, family members, and occasionally, if fortune allowed, a physician or barber surgeon called in for complications. The midwife was a central figure in this intimate scene, a woman skilled through experience and oral tradition, her knowledge passed down through generations. She was a guardian of life's threshold, well-versed in the rituals, herbs, and practical techniques that defined the art of delivery. The process of childbirth itself was long, arduous, and often unpredictable. There were no hospitals equipped with modern conveniences, no anesthetics to dull the pain, and no antiseptics to ward off infection. Women labored in whatever comfort their homes could provide, lying on beds or simple pallets, sometimes assisted by a birth stool, a wooden chair with an opening to allow gravity to aid delivery. The midwife's hands were steady and practiced, guiding the mother through contractions, offering encouragement, and, when possible, using gentle manipulations to assist the child's passage. Yet, even under the care of the most experienced midwife, dangers lurked at every turn. Complications such as obstructed labor, where the baby could not pass through the birth canal, or excessive bleeding after delivery, could quickly become fatal. Without the ability to perform surgical interventions such as cesarean sections, which were rarely attempted and almost always fatal, the options were limited and grim. The threat of puerperal fever, an infection that struck many women after childbirth, claimed countless lives, its cause unknown and its progression swift. Herbs and remedies played a vital role in managing the pain and dangers of childbirth. Midwives prepared poultices of herbs like rue, dill, and fennel to ease labor pains or to encourage contractions. The use of willow bark for its pain-relieving properties might soothe the agony of labor, while chamomile and lavender were believed to calm the nerves and ward off evil spirits. These remedies, while modest in effect compared to modern medicine, were cherished tools in the midwife's arsenal, blending practical knowledge with the spiritual beliefs that surrounded the birthing process. Spiritual protection was as important as physical care. Prayers, charms, and blessings were woven into the labor, with holy water sprinkled around the room and sacred relics placed near the mother's bed. The presence of the priest, when possible, was sought to administer last rites or to offer comfort through the sacraments. Childbirth was seen not only as a physical event, but as a crossing point between life and death, blessing and curse, a moment fraught with both peril and profound sacredness. The social status of women also shaped their experience of childbirth and health more broadly. Noble women might have access to trained physicians and the best midwives, as well as more comfortable surroundings. Yet even among the wealthy, the risks remain high. For peasant women, whose lives were intertwined with hard labor and often poor nutrition, childbirth could be especially dangerous. Their resilience was remarkable, but the toll of repeated pregnancies, combined with the physical demands of daily life, left many weakened and vulnerable to illness. Women's health in the medieval world extended beyond childbirth to encompass a range of conditions that were often misunderstood or stigmatized. Menstruation, fertility, pregnancy, and menopause were subjects wrapped in mystery and sometimes fear. Imbalances in the humors were thought to influence a woman's temperament and well-being, and treatments ranged from dietary changes to the use of potions and charms. Conditions such as hysteria, a catch-all term for various ailments believed to arise from the womb's movement within the body, were treated with a mixture of remedies, rituals, and sometimes outright dismissal. Gynecological knowledge was limited but evolving. Midwives and physicians sometimes employed pessaries made from herbs and other materials, inserted to relieve discomfort or aid fertility. Surgical interventions were rare and risky, though occasional reports tell of procedures to remove tumors or relieve pain. Much of women's health care remained in the hands of women themselves, midwives, herbalists, and healers, who combined empirical knowledge with the cultural and spiritual fabric of their communities. Despite the many dangers, childbirth was also a time of celebration and hope. The birth of a child was a reaffirmation of life's continuity, a source of joy that transcended hardship. Baptism followed quickly, often within hours, to welcome the infant into the Christian community and protect it from spiritual harm. Families gathered to offer gifts, prayers, and support, weaving new threads into the tapestry of their shared lives. The story of women's health and childbirth in the Middle Ages is thus one of contrast between suffering and resilience, ignorance and knowledge, fear and faith. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, the intimate acts of birth and care carry with them a quiet strength, a persistence that echoes through history. As the night deepens and the soft breath of sleep draws near, we leave behind the quiet rooms where new life struggles to begin and the women who bear the weight of it. The grim reality of medieval medicine is not only the story of pain and death, but also the enduring human spirit that seeks healing, comfort, and hope amid uncertainty. The quiet corridors of medieval life held many hidden struggles, many silent battles waged not in the visible wounds of the body, but in the unseen realms of the mind and spirit. Mental illness, in its many forms and faces, was a mystery wrapped in fear and misunderstanding, a condition both real and imagined, entwined with beliefs, fears, and hopes of a world that sought meaning in every shadow and sigh. It was a realm where medicine, religion, superstition, and social order collided, shaping how those who suffer were seen, treated, and often hidden away from sight. To the medieval mind, the balance of the humors extended beyond the physical body to influence temperament and mental states. Melancholy, a condition linked to an excess of black bile, was thought to bring sadness, despair, and lethargy. Its opposite, mania or hysteria, was associated with an excess of yellow bile, leading to restlessness, agitation, and fits of rage or sorrow. The mind was a mirror of the body's delicate equilibrium, and when that mirror cracked, the soul might wander into darkness or frenzy. But mental illness was also viewed through a spiritual lens. Afflictions of the mind were sometimes seen as signs of divine punishment, tests of faith, or the work of malevolent spirits. Those who spoke incoherently, heard voices, or displayed strange behaviors might be thought possessed by demons or bewitched by witches. In such cases, the boundary between medicine and religion blurred completely, and treatment might involve exorcisms, prayers, and rituals meant to drive out the evil. The fear surrounding mental illness often led to isolation and stigmatization. Those who suffer were sometimes hidden away in their own homes, cared for quietly by family, or placed in the care of religious institutions where monks and nuns might watch over them. In larger cities, leprosaria and almshouses occasionally took in those deemed mentally ill, though their understanding of the condition was limited, and care was often rudimentary. Hospitals of the time, while primarily focused on physical ailments, sometimes admitted the mentally ill, but their treatment options were scant. Restraint was common, whether by chained, confined rooms or enforced solitude. The goal was often containment rather than cure, a reflection of both limited knowledge and social fear. Yet within these walls, some sought to comfort and care with gentle words, herbs, and prayer, hoping to ease the troubled mind even if they could not fully heal it. Herbal remedies played a role here as well, with plants such as valerian, lavender, and sage used to calm agitation and promote sleep. These natural treatments, modest though their effects may have been, were valued for their gentleness and their alignment with the body's natural rhythms. At the same time, music, poetry, and art were sometimes employed to soothe the restless soul, recognizing in these quiet forms of expression a balm beyond the reach of more tangible medicines. Yet, amidst the fear and misunderstanding, there were voices of compassion and curiosity. Some physicians and scholars sought to observe and record mental symptoms, to classify them and search for causes rooted in the body rather than the spirit alone. These early attempts at understanding the mind hinted at the future of psychiatry, even if they remained tentative and fragmentary. Social and religious attitudes toward mental illness were complex and sometimes contradictory. While fear and exclusion were common, so too were acts of kindness and charity, often inspired by Christian teachings on mercy and care for the suffering. The mentally ill were seen both as cursed and as vulnerable, as threats and as souls in need of salvation. This tension shaped their place in medieval society, sometimes hidden, sometimes cared for, but always marked by otherness. As night deepens and the world grows still, we remember those whose minds wandered through shadowed landscapes of fear and confusion, those who lived on the edges of understanding, and the quiet efforts of those who sought to ease their suffering with whatever means they had. The grim reality of medieval medicine was not only a story of bodies and diseases, but also of minds, fragile, mysterious, and profoundly human. When the shadow of the plague once again darkened the towns and cities of medieval Europe, spreading its swift and merciless hand through crowded streets and quiet villages alike, a figure emerged from the midst of fear and necessity, known to history as the Plague Doctor. Clad in an eerie costume that seemed as much a talisman as protective gear, these doctors embodied both the hopes and the horrors of a world struggling to confront an invisible enemy whose nature was as mysterious as it was deadly. The costume of the Plague Doctor was striking and unforgettable, a long, dark cloak covering the body from head to toe, gloves shielding the hands, and a wide-brimmed hat identifying the wearer as a medical professional. Most distinctive of all was the mask, a bird-like beak filled with fragrant herbs, dried flowers, and pungent spices, designed to filter the putrid air believed to carry the plague's deadly contagion. The glass eye opening shielded the wearer's eye from miasmas and, perhaps more practically, from the dreadful sight of the sick and dying. To those who saw them, plague doctors were at once figures of dread and of desperate hope, a symbol of humanities who would confront death with knowledge, however incomplete, and with ritual. Their duties were grim and unending. Plague doctors traveled from house to house, examining the afflicted with a mixture of medical curiosity and dread, recording symptoms, advising families, and sometimes administering remedies, though none could truly halt the progress of the disease. Their notes and observations, sparse and often cryptic, provide some of the earliest clinical accounts of the plague's course, detailing the horrific swellings, fevers, and eventual decline or death of the patient. Yet their work was not only medical, but deeply entwined with superstition and ritual. The herbs tucked into the beak, such as rosemary, myrrh, and peppermint, were believed to purify the air and protect the doctor's soul from the miasma. They carried wooden canes, which served multiple purposes: to examine the sick without direct contact, to point or gesture without touching, and at times, to ward off the desperate or the dead. Their presence alone was both a comfort and a terror, a reminder that the plague was near and that death might follow swiftly. The plague doctors themselves were not immune to fear or suffering. Many were poorly trained. Sometimes elderly physicians called upon in desperation, or young men willing to risk their lives for payment or duty. Their days were long and exhausting, filled with the sights and smells of decay, the cries of the dying, and the heavy weight of helplessness. Some succumbed quickly to the very disease they sought to understand, their own deaths often unnoticed amid the greater toll. In towns and cities, the arrival of a plague doctor was a moment heavy with meaning. Families might clutch talismans or cross themselves fervently as the doctor approached. Some sought to bribe or beg for remedies. Others accepted their fate with quiet resignation. The doctor's role was as much to bear witness as to heal, to mark the sick, to report deaths, to try bring some order to chaos. Despite their limited success in curing the disease, plague doctors played a vital role in the medieval response to epidemics. Their records contributed to the slow accumulation of medical knowledge. Their rituals, though rooted in misunderstanding, helped communities find meaning and agency amid despair. And their eerie figures, cloaked and masked, remain among the most haunting symbols of a world caught between superstition and the first flickers of scientific thought. As night deepens and the flicker of candlelight fades into darkness, we leave behind the lonely figures moving through plague-ridden streets, their footsteps heavy with the weight of grim and relentless reality. The story of medieval medicine is not only one of pain and ignorance, but also of courage and the enduring human desire to confront the unknown, even when the cost is great. Long before the shadow of the Black Death fell upon medieval Europe, other contagious diseases had woven themselves quietly yet persistently into the fabric of daily life, shaping the experiences, fears, and medical responses of the age. While the plague's swift devastation and dramatic impact often dominate our memories of medieval medicine, it was but one among many illnesses that tested the resilience and understanding of societies struggling to cope with sickness and contagion. Diseases such as leprosy, smallpox, and tuberculosis haunted villages and cities alike, their presence felt in the slow erosion of bodies and the social fabric, their mysteries confounding physicians, healers, and laypeople alike. Leprosy, perhaps one of the most feared and misunderstood of these ailments, carried a weight that extended far beyond the physical symptoms it produced. Known today as Hansen's disease, leprosy in medieval times was a disease both of the flesh and of the spirit, deeply entwined with ideas of purity, sin, and social exclusion. The visible signs of the disease, discolored patches of skin, nodules, and gradual loss of sensation that led to injury and deformity, marked those afflicted as outcasts, marked for isolation and stigma. Leprosy's social consequences were severe. Across Europe, communities established leper houses or lazar houses, isolated dwellings often located on the outskirts of towns or in remote countryside, where those with the disease were confined for their own protection and that of others. These colonies were at once sanctuaries and prisons, places where the sick could find some care and companionship among others similarly afflicted, but also places of profound loneliness and despair. The gates of these houses were often guarded, and the residents required to wear distinctive clothing or carry clappers to announce their presence, so that the healthy might keep their distance. The medical understanding of leprosy in the Middle Ages was limited and shaped by the theories of humors, spiritual causation, and fear of contagion. Physicians recognized the disease's progressive nature and its symptoms, but could offer little more than palliative care and isolation. Treatments ranged from herbal salves and baths to prayers and rituals seeking divine intervention. In some cases, the afflicted might undergo symbolic acts of penance or blessing, reflecting the belief that their condition was both a physical ailment and a spiritual trial. Smallpox, another disease that left its mark in medieval Europe, was known for its sudden onset and striking symptoms. Patients would experience high fever, fatigue, and the appearance of pustules, raised, blister-like lesions that covered the body in a painful rash. Survivors were often left with pock-marked skin, a visible reminder of the disease's ravages. Though less socially isolating than leprosy, smallpox was feared for its high mortality rate, especially among children, and for the way it could sweep through entire families and communities with devastating speed. The treatments for smallpox were largely supportive and symptomatic, as the causes and transmission of the disease remained unknown. Physicians prescribed baths, herbal remedies to reduce fever, and poultices to soothe the skin. The importance of clean air and fresh water was acknowledged in some quarters, and measures to separate the sick from the healthy were occasionally implemented, though often inconsistently. In many cases, families cared for their own, providing comfort as best they could while watching helplessly as the disease ran its course. Tuberculosis, sometimes called consumption due to the wasting away it caused, was a more insidious disease, creeping slowly through its victims with persistent cough, night sweats, and gradual weight loss. Unlike the sudden horrors of plague or smallpox, tuberculosis was a prolonged illness, draining strength over months or years, often misdiagnosed or conflated with other wasting diseases. The medieval understanding of its contagious nature was limited, and the disease was frequently attributed to imbalances in the humors or to hereditary weakness. Treatments for tuberculosis range from rest and dietary recommendations to herbal concoctions believed to strengthen the lungs and body. Physicians sometimes prescribed fresh air, recommending stays in the countryside or mountains, long before the scientific discovery of bacteria. Infected individuals might withdraw from public life, their decline slow and marked by increasing isolation. In all these diseases, the challenge of contagion shaped social responses and medical practices. Fear of infection led to quarantine measures, isolation of the sick, and sometimes brutal exclusion of those perceived as threats to communal health. The tension between care and fear was ever present, as families and communities balanced compassion with self-preservation. The role of religion and spirituality permeated the experience of contagious disease in medieval society. Illness was often seen as a test of faith or a punishment for sin, and prayers, pilgrimages, and the invocation of saints formed an essential part of treatment. Hospitals founded by religious orders provided care, shelter, and comfort, blending medical practice with spiritual support. The care of the sick was regarded as a sacred duty, a reflection of Christian charity, even as stigma and fear complicated the reality. Despite the limitations of medieval medicine, these diseases spurred developments in public health and medical knowledge. The necessity of isolating the sick led to early quarantine laws, and the documentation of symptoms and outbreaks laid the groundwork for future epidemiological study. The blending of empirical observation with spiritual care created a complex but enduring framework for confronting illness. As darkness deepens and the world settles into quiet stillness, we remember those who live with these hidden diseases, marked by fear and compassion, by isolation and care, and the fragile, evolving understanding that shaped their experience. The grim reality of medieval medicine was not only a story of suffering, but also one of endurance, humanity, and the slow, patient journey toward knowledge and healing. In the quiet, shadowed corners of monasteries, universities, and scholars' chambers, the written word became a powerful vessel for preservation and transmission of medical knowledge throughout the Middle Ages, a time when books were precious treasures painstakingly copied by hand, their pages fragile but their contents enduring. These early medical texts, often richly illuminated and bound with care, carried within them the accumulated wisdom of centuries, blending the teachings of ancient Greece and Rome, the insight of Arabic scholars, and the observations of medieval practitioners who sought to understand the mysteries of the human body and its ailments. The journey of medical knowledge in medieval Europe was one of continuity and change, where tradition was both a foundation and a challenge. The texts most revered were those attributed to classical authorities, such as Hippocrates, the father of medicine, and Galen, whose writings on anatomy, physiology, and the humor shaped medical thought for over a millennium. Their works, translated into Latin from Greek and Arabic, formed the core of medical education in the great universities, read and memorized by students who often approached them with reverence bordering on faith. Yet these texts were not static. They were studied, commented upon, and sometimes contested by medieval scholars who sought to reconcile ancient teachings with their own observations and the practical realities of their time. Glosses and marginal notes filled the pages of manuscripts, recording debates, corrections, and new interpretations. This scholastic engagement breathed life into the texts, making them living documents rather than mere relics of the past. The transmission of medical knowledge was closely linked to the networks of monasteries and religious houses, where monks labored as scribes, copying texts with meticulous care. These centers of learning were vital in preserving not only religious manuscripts, but also scientific and medical treatises, ensuring that knowledge survived through times of war, plague, and upheaval. Scriptoria, with their rows of desks bathed in candlelight, echoed with the scratching of quills as generations of scribes faithfully reproduced the words of physicians long gone. The arrival of Arabic medical texts in Europe, translated in places like Toledo and Sicily, introduced fresh perspectives and expanded the horizons of medieval medicine. Works by scholars such as Avicenna al-Razi and Ibn al-Nafis offered new understandings of anatomy, pharmacology, and the nature of disease, challenging the European medical establishment to reconsider long-held beliefs. These texts emphasized clinical observation, the importance of empirical evidence, and sometimes even suggested surgical procedures previously unknown in the West. However, the introduction of new knowledge was not always welcome without suspicion. The tension between tradition and innovation was palpable. Some scholars and practitioners clung fiercely to the authority of classical authors, wary of ideas that threatened the established order. Universities could be battlegrounds of intellectual debate, where conservative forces resisted change and progressive voices sought reform. This dynamic, though fraught, was essential for the eventual advancement of medical science. The physical form of these medical texts also shaped their use and dissemination. Manuscripts were expensive and rare, owned primarily by wealthy scholars, physicians, and institutions. The rise of universities created demand for standardized texts, leading to production of commentaries and teaching aids designed to guide students through complex medical concepts. Over time, as the art printing began to emerge, the potential for wider dissemination of medical knowledge grew, setting the stage for the Renaissance and the explosion of scientific inquiry. Within these pages lay detailed descriptions of diseases, treatments, and anatomical structures, but also reflections on the nature, health, and the balance required for well-being. They captured the humoral theory that dominated medieval medicine, the delicate interplay of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and offered remedies intended to restore harmony. Yet they also preserved the earliest glimpses of empirical methods, encouraging physicians to observe carefully and learn from experience. The preservation and study of medical texts were acts of devotion and curiosity, reflecting the complex relationship between knowledge, faith, and practice in medieval society. They were tools for teaching and healing, but also symbols of the enduring human quest to understand the mysteries of life and disease. As candlelight flickers softly in quiet chambers and the ancient pages rest beneath gentle hands, we are reminded that the grim reality of medieval medicine was not only shaped by suffering and superstition, but also by the patient accumulation of knowledge, a legacy that would one day illuminate the path toward modern healing. In the intricate web of medieval medicine, the threads of learned knowledge and popular healing were deeply entwined, creating a complex tapestry where faith, tradition, and practical experience wove together to form the fabric of care for the sick and suffering. While universities and physicians cultivated theories and texts steeped in ancient authority and emerging scholarship, the daily reality for most people, whether in bustling towns or remote villages, was shaped by a rich and varied tradition of religious and folk healing practices. These traditions, far from being mere superstition or ignorance, reflected a profound understanding of the human condition and the cultural forces that shape health and illness. The central role of religion in medieval life permeated all aspects of healing. The belief that physical and spiritual well-being were inseparable meant that prayers, rituals, and divine intervention were essential components of medical care. The Church, as a dominant institution, not only provided hospitals and care for the ill, but also shaped the understanding of disease as a test of faith, a punishment for sin, or a challenge to the soul. Illness was seen as a condition that affected body and spirit alike, and healing required attention to both realms. Pilgrimages to holy sites were among the most common religious healing practices. People traveled long distances, sometimes enduring great hardship, to visit shrines of saints reputed for their miraculous cures. The waters of holy springs, the touch of relics, or the prayers said in sacred spaces were believed to hold healing power, often credited with alleviating ailments that defied the skill of physicians. Such pilgrimages were acts of devotion and hope, offering not only the possibility of physical relief, but also spiritual renewal and community connection. Within churches and monasteries, relics of saints, fragments of bone, cloth, or objects associated with holy figures, were carefully preserved and venerated. These relics were thought to channel divine power, and touching or being near them could bring healing or protection. The rituals surrounding relics were deeply symbolic, blending faith and medicine in ways that comforted the sick and reinforced social bonds. Festivals, processions, and prayers dedicated to healing saints punctuated the medieval calendar, reminding communities of the ever-present hope for mercy. The sacraments of the Church played a significant role in healing as well. The anointing of the sick, formerly known as extreme unction, was administered to those seriously ill, offering spiritual strength in preparation for death or recovery. Confession and penance were sometimes seen as necessary steps toward healing, reflecting the belief that sin and illness were connected. Clergy, as spiritual healers, provided comfort, guidance, and ritual care that complemented the work of physicians and midwives. Alongside these religious practices flourished a rich and diverse tradition of folk medicine, carried forward by women and men whose knowledge was rooted in observation, experience, and the natural world. Folk healers, often known as cunning folk, wise women, or herbalists, serve as the primary source of care for many communities. Their remedies included herbal preparations, charms, incantations, and ritual acts designed to treat both physical symptoms and the unseen forces thought to cause illness. Herbs and plants gathered from fields, forests, and gardens were transformed into tinctures, poultices, salves, and teas. Knowledge of which plants to use, how to prepare them, and when to administer them was closely guarded and passed down through families and apprenticeships. The use of herbs like chamomile for calming, nettle for cleansing, or St. John's wort for wounds illustrates a practical understanding of the medicinal properties of nature, even if framed in the language of humors and spirits. Folk healing also embraced the power of symbols, words, and ritual. Charms and amulets, inscribed with sacred words or signs, were worn or placed on the body to ward off evil and illness. Incantations and prayers, often spoken softly at the bedside, were believed to call upon protective spirits or saints. Rituals such as the laying on of hands or the use of holy water mingled with older pagan customs, creating a syncretic blend of beliefs that varied from place to place but shared a common purpose: to restore balance and health. The relationship between learned medicine and folk healing was not always straightforward. At times, official church authorities and medical practitioners viewed folk practices with suspicion, associating them with superstition, heresy, or witchcraft. Trials and persecutions targeted some healers, especially women, accused of causing harm or consorted with dark forces. Yet in many cases, these traditions coexisted peacefully and even complemented one another. Physicians might recommend herbal remedies gathered by local healers. Prayers and sacraments were often combined with medical treatments. This coexistence reflects the deeply human need to seek comfort and control amid illness, drawing on every available resource, scientific, spiritual, and traditional. The boundaries between magic, religion, and medicine were porous, shaped by the cultural context and the urgent desire to heal. For many medieval people, the source of healing was less important than the hope it inspired and the care it provided. The diverse landscape of medieval healing practices also reveals the roles of gender and social status. Women, as midwives, herbalists, and caregivers, were central to folk medicine, their knowledge vital to family and community health. Noble households might employ physicians schooled in universities, but also depended on the wisdom of local healers for everyday ailments. This interplay of knowledge systems enriched medieval medicine and laid foundations for future developments. As the candle burns low and silence settles over the sleeping world, the mingling of faith, tradition, and empirical care reminds us that the grim reality of medieval medicine was not solely one of ignorance or fear, but a tapestry woven from the threads of human hope, resilience, and the enduring quest to heal body and soul alike. In the sprawling tapestry of medieval life, where sickness and health dance precariously amid the uncertainties of everyday existence, the emergence and evolution of hospitals and public health measures stand as remarkable testaments to humanity's enduring efforts to care for the sick and protect communities from disease. Though often far removed from the modern institutions we know today, these early hospitals and public health initiatives were places and practices shaped by faith, charity, practical necessity, and a slowly deepening understanding of illness. They arose not only as shelters for the ill, but also as complex social institutions embedded within the religious and cultural fabric of the time. The origins of medieval hospitals trace back to the charitable impulses of Christian communities, rooted deeply in the teachings of compassion and mercy found in the Gospels. Early on, care for the sick was largely provided within monastic communities, where monks and nuns tended the ill as part of their spiritual duty. These religious houses often included infirmaries, where the sick and elderly found shelter, food, and rudimentary medical care amid prayers and rituals. Here, healing was as much a spiritual endeavor as a physical one, and the blending of care and devotion defined the early hospital experience. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the growth of towns and cities, the rise of pilgrimage, and the increasing awareness of contagious diseases led to the establishment of more specialized hospitals. These institutions, often founded and funded by wealthy patrons or religious orders, served multiple roles: as places for the poor and sick to find refuge, as centers for lepers and the mentally ill, and sometimes as hospices for the dying. The medieval hospital was as much a sanctuary as a medical facility, its walls sheltering those whom society often marginalized. One of the most famous examples of medieval hospitals is the Hotel Dieu in Paris, founded in the 7th century and expanded over the centuries. It was among the earliest institutions to provide organized care with dedicated staff, including physicians, surgeons, and attendants tending to patients. Similar hospitals sprang up across Europe, in London, Rome, Florence, and countless smaller towns, each reflecting the local needs, resources, and religious affiliations of their communities. The architecture of these hospitals was designed with both practical and symbolic purposes. Large wards with rows of beds accommodated many patients, often separated by gender or disease. Chapels and prayer rooms were integral parts of the complex, reminding both patients and caregivers of the spiritual dimension of healing. Gardens with medicinal herbs provided remedies, and kitchens prepared food believed to nourish the body and spirit. Despite limited understanding of contagion and hygiene by modern standards, these institutions attempted to create environments conducive to care and recovery. However, medieval hospitals faced immense challenges. Overcrowding was common, and the high demand for care often outstripped resources. Sanitation was rudimentary, and the close quarters sometimes facilitated the spread of infection rather than its containment. Medical knowledge among hospital staff varied widely, with some physicians and surgeons well-trained and others relying on traditional remedies and superstition. Still, the dedication of caregivers, both religious and lay, was unwavering, providing comfort and relief to countless individuals in times of distress. Alongside the development of hospitals, medieval authorities and communities began to grapple with the broader challenge of public health, how to protect populations from the spread of contagious diseases, and maintain a semblance of order amid outbreaks. Though the concept of disease transmission was poorly understood, observations of how illness spread through close contact, foul air, or contaminated water led to the implementation of early quarantine and sanitation measures. The response to epidemics, such as the plague, catalyzed some of the most significant public health actions. Cities like Venice, Milan, and Florence pioneered quarantine protocols, isolating ships and travelers suspected of carrying disease for 40 days, a practice in which the term quarantine derives. Lazarettos, or quarantine stations, were established near ports to monitor and contain arrivals, reflecting a pragmatic, if limited, approach to disease control. City authorities also sought to regulate cleanliness in the streets and markets, though their efforts met with mixed success. Waste disposal, removal of dead animals, and maintenance of water sources became concerns tied not only to aesthetic but to health considerations. Public bathhouses, once centers of hygiene and social life, faced restrictions or closures in some areas due to fears of contagion, illustrating the complex balance between cultural practices and health concerns. Moreover, laws were enacted to limit the movement of the sick, mandate the cleaning of homes, and restrict gatherings during outbreaks. These measures, while often unpopular and difficult to enforce, demonstrated an emerging awareness of communal responsibility for health. The tension between individual liberty and public safety, so familiar to modern readers, was already present in medieval society. Shaped by the urgency of survival and the fear of invisible enemies, religious and civic leaders played crucial roles in coordinating care and public health responses. Religious order staff hospitals offered prayers for the sick and provided moral guidance. City councils and magistrates enacted ordinances, organized watchmen to enforce quarantines, and sometimes commissioned physicians to advise on outbreaks. This cooperation between spiritual and secular authorities formed a foundation for the evolving systems of health governance. While medieval hospitals and public health measures were imperfect and limited by the knowledge and resources of their time, they represented vital steps toward organized care and community protection. They laid the groundwork for the later development of modern medicine and public health infrastructure, embodying the persistent human commitment to alleviate suffering and guard against disease. As darkness settles and the world quiets into sleep, the stories of these early institutions remind us of the resilience and ingenuity that emerge even in the bleakest of times. The grim reality of medieval medicine, with all its challenges and contradictions, is also a story of hope, compassion, and the enduring quest to heal and protect one another amid uncertainty. In the gentle unfolding of history's vast tapestry, the closing centuries of the medieval era stand as a threshold, a liminal space where the ancient and the emerging world intertwined in delicate balance, setting the stage for profound transformation in the understanding of medicine and disease. The Renaissance, a blossoming of art, science, and human curiosity that began in the late 14th century and carried forward into the following centuries, awakened Europe from the long shadow of medieval tradition and cast new light upon the body, the mind, and the mysteries of health and illness. Yet this awakening was neither sudden nor complete. Rather, it was a slow, often halting journey marked by continuity as well as change, where old beliefs met new discoveries, and where the grim realities of medieval medicine continued to shape the path forward. At the heart of this transformation lay a renewed interest in the ancient texts and knowledge that had long been the foundation of medieval medical practice. The works of Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna were revisited with fresh eyes, often rediscovered in original Greek or Latin texts, sometimes newly translated and annotated by scholars eager to expand their understanding. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century dramatically increased the availability of these texts, allowing knowledge to spread beyond the confines of monasteries and university libraries to a broader audience of physicians, students, and curious minds. This democratization of medical literature fostered an environment ripe for questioning, debate, and innovation. One of the most significant shifts brought about by the Renaissance was a gradual move from reliance on authoritative texts alone toward direct observation and empirical investigation. Pioneering figures such as Andreas Vesalius challenged long-held anatomical teachings, conducting dissections and producing detailed illustrations that corrected centuries of errors inherited from Galen. Vesalius's work, published in his monumental book De Humani Corporis Fabrica in 1543, revealed the human body with unprecedented clarity, emphasizing the importance of first-hand study over unquestioning acceptance of tradition. This spirit of inquiry extended beyond anatomy into the study of disease and treatment. Physicians and natural philosophers began to question the humoral theory that had dominated medieval medicine, seeking instead to understand disease processes through observation of symptoms, patterns of contagion, and effects of various interventions. The plague and other epidemics continued to challenge medical knowledge, but they also spurred efforts to document outbreaks, trace transmission, and develop rudimentary forms of public health. This blending of traditional and new approaches reflected the complexity of the time, a willingness to retain valuable wisdom while embracing the possibilities of scientific discovery. The Renaissance also witnessed a flowering of surgical practice, which had long been considered a lower form of medical care, often performed by barber surgeons rather than university-trained physicians. Figures such as Ambrose Paré revolutionized surgical techniques and treatments, advocating for more humane care of wounds and introducing innovative methods, such as ligatures to control bleeding. These advances improved outcomes for many patients and laid the groundwork for the rise of surgery as a respected medical discipline. Pharmacology, too, evolved during this period, as the knowledge of medicinal plants expanded through exploration and trade. Herbal manuals grew in detail and accuracy, and the cultivation of botanical gardens for medical study became common in universities and monasteries. The increasing availability of diverse substances, from spices and resins brought from distant lands to newly identified compounds, enriched the repertoire of remedies, even as the understanding of their effects remained incomplete. Yet, even as these advances unfolded, the Renaissance was still a world where the spiritual and the scientific coexisted uneasily. Religious beliefs about illness and healing persisted alongside emerging medical theories. The Church continued to play a significant role in care through hospitals and charitable institutions, and many physicians remained deeply religious, seeing their work as a service not only to the body but to the soul. Superstition and magic, folk remedies and learned medicine, existed side by side, reflecting a culture grappling with the limits of human knowledge and the mysteries that defied explanation. The social context of medicine also shifted during the Renaissance. The rise of cities and the growth of wealth created new opportunities and challenges for healthcare. Universities expanded, training more physicians and encouraging research. Printing made medical knowledge more accessible, yet disparities in access to care persisted, with the poor often relying on traditional healers and folk remedies. The roles of women in medicine remain complex, with midwives and herbalists continuing to provide essential services even as formal medical institutions marginalize their contributions. Importantly, The Renaissance did not bring an immediate end to the grim realities of disease and death. Epidemics continued to sweep through Europe, and many illnesses remained poorly understood and untreatable. The scars of medieval medicine lingered, and the transition toward modern medical science was gradual and uneven. However, the period's renewed emphasis on observation, inquiry, and education planted seeds that would, over time, transform medicine from a blend of faith and tradition into a discipline grounded increasingly in evidence and experiment. As night deepens and the world slips into quiet repose, the story of this pivotal era reminds us that progress often comes in fits and starts, shaped by the interplay of old and new, belief and discovery. The grim reality of medieval medicine, with all its limitations and hardships, was not an end but a beginning, a foundation upon which the future of healing would be built. In the quiet stillness of history's unfolding, as centuries pass and the world moves steadily toward modernity, the legacy of medieval medicine endures like a faint but persistent echo, a complex resonance of human hope, resilience, curiosity, and a relentless striving to understand and heal despite profound challenges. Though the grim realities of disease, ignorance, and suffering shaped the medieval experience of health, they also forged a foundation upon which the vast edifice of modern medicine will be constructed, a foundation built not only of knowledge but compassion, adaptation, and the courage to confront the unknown. Medieval medicine was a world of contrasts, where faith and fear intertwined with empirical observation, where learned scholars debated ancient texts even as folk healers tended the daily ailments of communities, where hospitals served both as sanctuaries and as sites of desperate struggle, where plague doctors walked darkened streets bearing rituals of protection amid overwhelming death. This world, far from a simple tale of ignorance, reveals the multifaceted human response to suffering, shaped by cultural beliefs, social structures, and the limits of contemporary knowledge. The endurance of medieval medical thought, with its humoral theory and its blend of spiritual and physical healing, testifies to the deep need for explanation and control in the face of illness. It reminds us that medicine is not only a science, but a profoundly human endeavor, shaped by the stories we tell ourselves about the body, the soul, and the world around us. These stories shaped how societies cared for sick, how they managed fear and uncertainty, and how they sought meaning even in the darkest hours. Perhaps most importantly, the history of medieval medicine teaches us about the value of persistence and compassion. Despite limited tools and frequent failure, caregivers, whether physicians, monks, midwives, or family members, devoted themselves to easing suffering and preserving life. Their efforts, often humble and unseen, form a thread connecting past to present, reminding us that medicine is as much about presence and empathy as about cures and knowledge. The struggles of the medieval world with epidemics, mental illness, chronic disease, and the frailty of the human body resonate with our own time as we continue to confront new challenges in health and medicine. The balance of science, spirituality, and cultural understanding remains delicate, and the lessons of history encourage humility, patience, and a recognition that healing is a journey rather than a destination. As we close this chapter on the grim reality of medieval medicine and disease, it is fitting to remember those countless individuals whose lives were shaped by these forces: the patients, the healers, the scholars, and the communities. Their stories, often silent and shadowed by time, speak to the enduring human spirit that seeks light in darkness, knowledge in mystery, and hope in despair. May this reflection bring not only understanding but also peace, as you rest now and let the quiet flow of history lull you toward gentle dreams. The past, with all its hardships and triumphs, remains companion on our journey, a reminder that even amid the most challenging times, the will to heal and to care endures, quietly and steadfastly, through the ages. Good night.